Yeah, nice to be here. Thanks, everybody. We're a little note on the title, little description. So we're going to highlight, we're going to showcase a couple maps that we've been working on. One that's focused on the issue of redlining in the 1930s, and a second one we probably won't spend quite as much time on, but it's on the forced migration of enslaved people in the half century before the Civil War. I can give you a longer explanation for that title, but we're trying to map the slave trade, essentially, the domestic slave trade. And so just a little explanation about our title. You know, these for us, we have a lot of maps. You want to scroll down a little bit to the maps? We're working on this atlas of U.S. history, but the ones, at least I think we seem to have the most passion about tend to focus on issues in inequality in U.S. history, and particularly African-American history. And so we borrow our title and took some inspiration for the Redlining project in particular from Ta-Nehisi Coates' work, and he's made this argument that we should think about plunder. The issue of plunder is one of the main threads in American history, the extraction of wealth from African-Americans and African-American communities, and both of these maps what we want to talk about are focused on those issues, one in the 20th century, one in the 19th century. So yeah, it's good to steal ideas from Ta-Nehisi Coates. He's a good person to steal from. Though that sounds terrible, right? A white guy, and I'm like, wait, we'll leave that aside, how bad of a way of putting that was. So what we want to start with is a map, or a bunch of maps, that we've been working on that are on the topic of redlining in the 1930s and throughout the 20th century, really. So if you're unfamiliar with redlining, redlining refers to the practice of, can you go to Tacoma? Let's start with Tacoma. It's a practice of denying mortgage and other financial instruments to particular locations, often by the idea of redlining is you draw a red line around areas on a map and say that these are areas that are too hazardous to loan into. And for much of the 20th century, that's been communities of color, most often African-American communities. And though the term wasn't in use, the quintessential example of redlining maps were maps that were produced by the federal, well, at the behest of the federal government, through an agency, a New Deal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the second half of the 1930s. So this is one of those maps. And what they did is, actually, can you click on, just click on anything. And then can you scroll down and bring up the survey instrument, just the scan. So they work with local realtors and bankers, and they gave them essentially a kind of form, a survey to do for the neighborhoods that the local realtors themselves would use their local knowledge. So just think of a neighborhood, and they would do a survey on that, and they would describe who was there, information about the buildings, information about the rental and sales history of the neighborhood, some things about amenities and detracting factors, right? Like, is it near parks? Is it got good transportation? Is it near an industrial site? And then, well, you scroll down a little bit, and then they also have a clarifying remark, like why that presents a more qualitative assessment of the neighborhood. And can you close that and go back to the maps? And then through a process that was, there's not like a clear rubric to do this by any means, they would give it a grade. So they would grade it on a scale of A to D. So A neighborhoods were best, and those were deemed to have just be very minimal risk involved for banks and financial institutions that might give loans into those areas. Bs were still desirable, so not quite as good. Cs were declining. These were areas where according to these standards, this was more risky, and then Ds were hazardous. These are areas that it's hazardous to give, according to the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and local realtors to give loans into. And Spoiler alert, I'll just kind of jump forward. These tend to be really heavily racialized. So most D neighborhoods were African-American neighborhoods, neighborhoods with immigrants, Jews. C neighborhoods, I mean, I'm painting with broad brush here, but those tended to be working class neighborhoods. B neighborhoods tend to be kind of white collar neighborhoods, and then A's were the wealthier, tonier neighborhoods in a city. Can you hit D1? Can you zoom into D1? So this is, I'm just picking these out because these are places I lived. So this is where I went to school, it was University of Puget Sound, and on a little bit away from the Puget, the UPS, is a neighborhood called the Proctor District, and you see there's a B2 and a D1. And can you scroll down and bring up the area description for that?
The scheme?
Let's get it off the thing. We'll read it off the and scroll down. So just to kind of make the so the point I want to make really quickly is that that D neighborhoods, like race was enough to, in most cases, give a neighborhood, the presence of people of color were enough to give a neighborhood a D grade, right? And sometimes this becomes very explicit. So this is the example. About 700 African Americans in Tacoma, just about 1/2%. And the clarifying remark for D1, this kind of sub area in the Proctor District, was 3 highly respected Negro families own homes and live in the middle block of this area facing Verde Street. While very much above the average of their race, it is quite generally recognized by realtors that their presence seriously detracts from the desirability of their immediate neighborhood, right? So you've got 3 families, and that becomes a basis for this particular area really being cut off. And let's be explicit about the consequences of this, right? The consequences of this is that these neighborhoods can't get the mortgage financing, and mortgage financing, particularly those that are backed by the federal government in the 20th century, right? This becomes the most straightforward route into wealth accumulation in the 20th century, home ownership, right? So the federal government, in any number of ways, it's just being one of those ways, gives entitlements essentially, and makes it easier for white families to accumulate wealth through home ownership, and makes this very difficult for families of color. Painted with a broad brush, but it's but not much. Can you go to Richmond? I'll give you one more example. I just go around the cities I live in and pick out the worst things in these maps. And can you hit the C4, the bird park, and scroll down to, why don't we open it up? I like seeing them on the thing. Scroll down. So this is a neighborhood in the city that Justin and I live in, and the white neighborhood in the 1930s, and the clarifying remark is this area is yellow largely because the school for white children is in the Negro area D8, and because the Negroes of D8 pass back and forth for access to the Williamsburg Park, which lies to the west. So another instance, like it's not just, and it's a fully segregated neighborhood, right? I mean, there's not African Americans living in it, but the presence of African Americans walking across it lowers the grade in these surveys, right? And resulted in being a C neighborhood rather than D neighborhood, or a C neighborhood rather than a B neighborhood. Okay, so can you close that, and let's close the neighborhood, yeah. And can you hit the info button for the Burgess diagram or whatever that? So one thing, like just for this kind of visualizations, I want to just briefly mention. Can you scroll down and show the diagram? So there's this very famous diagram from the 1920s by a sociologist, Ernest Burgess, that he was trying to theorize the expansion and organization of American cities. And it's in some ways kind of recognizable, right? He came up with what's been called the concentric zone theory, which you have a central business district, and around that, this is early 20th century, you have a factory zone. Around that, you have slums and working class homes, and then the further out you get these suburbs, which are residential zones, essentially middle class zones, single family units, and then wealthier people can commute in because they have cars and using early 20th century transportation. Can you scroll down a little bit more? So he This is both a natural theory, right? He was using metaphors of plant ecology. He said that these are expanding zones, and he likened that to succession in plant ecology. And he also used the metaphor of the body. It's not even really a metaphor. I mean, he's thinking about these as kind of biological processes where the city is an organism that has differentiation that makes it work, right? And that so he very much naturalized the city rather than seeing the city as a product of political and social decisions, that it's this kind of natural thing that has its inevitable evolution and organization. And this was very racialized in his account. So he applied this he was in the University of Chicago, he applies this to Chicago, and you can get a sense of how racialized this is. In the inner loop, you have Chinatown, Little Sicily, underworld, slums. A little further out, you have what we called old immigrants, Deutschland, right? And then beyond that, you have the bright light areas and the single family dwellings, right? So the further out you get, the better, essentially, in this model in terms of quality of inhabitants. So one thing we're kind of playing with really is, you can go ahead and close that, kind of like a toy to get people to think about these spatially, but also a heuristic device to think about the organization of American cities, is think about these maps as a application of that theory, right? So like, let's take Richmond. So if we pick the place in the middle of the city, and all the interior of that is red areas, D areas, and then can you go to, let's go to, and then even in the second ring, those are all out in the exterior, and then if you look at the yellow, those are more on the interior, and these are more on the exterior. So, we're kind of playing with this as and the idea behind this is that what Burgess's theory was in some ways descriptive, but when it becomes applied in these maps and becomes a mechanism of wealth distribution and public policy, it becomes prescriptive, right? I mean, it makes the reality that it ostensibly describes. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that really produces problems in the inner city that then become the subject of urban renewal efforts in the 1960s. And let's just throw a couple of these. So can you bring up Philadelphia? Just a quick look at a couple of these maps. And you can get the sense of, it actually does kind of work out, right? Around the city, you get red areas. Further out, you get yellow and green areas. Let's check Baltimore real quick, and just one more example. Close by. This one, you don't have to go over the rings to see that pattern, right? It's red surrounded by yellow with blue and green on the periphery. I'm going to turn over to Justin to talk a little bit about how we did this.
So this is a good segue from the last presentation about georeferencing, which we did a lot of in this project. I think we have georeferenced 140 maps so far, with still more to go, close to 200, I think is the final number. We're still finding new maps that we did not have, if that makes sense. So you can see we've done a lot, and we're also working on digitizing polygons for these georeference maps as well. And so the polygons actually drive the visualization that you see of the concentric circles that go on behind each city. So the process for these goes georeferencing. We use 2010 tiger lines, which can be problematic in itself, because these are usually from the 1930s to around the 1940s. So most cities have stayed the same as far as the heart of the city, right? So the grid-like structures, but some have changed a lot, depending on where you are. So that makes it a little tougher to georeference some of these maps. But most of them line up pretty well. I would say we're, in the mid to high 90s as far as accuracy of georeferencing these maps. For older cities, were a lot higher because the roads line up very well. So once the maps are georeferenced, we then start to digitize the polygons, and we literally, draw the areas. We give them the grade, and then that way we can do all the cool visualizations that you see here, right? So you can look at
Don't
the
have that one
rings. You can also look at the bar at the top, and you can see, for instance, like in this view, you can see the number
sorry.
of grades. Oh, you're fine. And then up top, grading in terms of area. So the polygons are driving kind of all of that. So they're very important in this visualization. Also, we wanted people to be able to download these and do things for their city. So you can download the GeoTIFF, download the polygons. Here's what I was talking about. So you can look at it kind of a broad.
Or you will be able to once we.
Yeah, you can look at a broad range of cities and see where they fall as far as areas of C, areas of D.
Oh, down here.
Yeah, and then you can download the GeoJSON, the shape files, and then.
Or will be able to. This is
Will
still
be,
work
yeah.
in progress, so this is why I got to revisit this. This is not not working perfectly.
And then also at the national view, if you click out, yeah, right. So you can get a kind of a broad sense of this, city layout as far as grades, right? So you can see areas that have more D grades, that have more C grades, right? You can see a lot of here in the Black Belt, right? You can see heavily degraded neighborhoods. So I'll talk about the concentric circles. So I think a lot of people here have done multi-ring buffers in ARC and Esri, right? Which is fairly easy to do. Not so easy in PostGIS on the fly. So we took us a little while to figure out how to do this. Because in PostGIS, it's really easy to make concentric circles, like multi-ring buffers is basically what I'm talking about. But the problem is that they overlap. So we wanted these to be cut out, so that way we could find out the number of grades in the area that fell within each one of these rings. So that was quite a challenge, I think, of this too. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to pivot and talk about just about as if that wasn't depressing enough. Let's actually really deal with the garbage that is sometimes American history. So this is a map of the slave trade or the forced migration of enslaved people. Not all people who are forcibly moved, right? Some people move with their owner, if their owner relocated, but probably 2/3 of the forced migrations that took place in the half century before the Civil War involved trade. Yeah. So and it's about a million people is the estimate, right? And we have to estimate this, and Justin will talk about this a little bit more. There's no census data. There's census data about the number of enslaved people there are, but there's no census data about nativity, right? Because for any number of reasons, most of which were like, understandably, slave owners didn't want the federal government mucking with the people that they owned, right? So they were pretty resistant to collecting much information about enslaved people. So we have counts, and from those we try to reverse engineer estimates of in-migrations and out-migrations, purchases and sales, or at least 2/3 of purchases and sales. And so what you're seeing here, this is for the 1810s, so we use the census from 1820 and 1810 to estimate in-migrations and out-migrations. The areas of red, the biggest dot that we show represents 1,200 people. 1,200 people that are either, in the blue case, moved from those locations, and in the red, moved to those locations, right? So this tells a story we're familiar, where we are now, right? All around Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, those where tobacco economy was suffering, and so was the quality of the soil, and they had a growing African-American enslaved population. Those were sold to areas that were becoming, particularly in the wake of the kind of cotton booms of the early 19th century,
just seemingly unending demand for enslaved labor. So in this case, you see that pushing against these two big holes are Native American areas, right? This is Creeks, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole areas. But you can see in the 1810s maps how in what's now central Georgia, that was really kind of pushing white migration and settlement of African Americans. This growing cotton economy was pushing aggressively against those lands. And if we jump forward a decade, can you go to the 1820s? The Indian secessions of that period, of seizures of those lands, settlers rushed into that, American settlers, with most of those being less white people and more African Americans who were forcibly brought into those regions to cultivate cotton. Let's go to the 1830s. This is a kind of, let's just turn off cotton and sugar for the moment just to focus on. So this is the worst decade for the slave trade, where you've had the largest cotton boom. And you can see this kind of massive amount of purchasing that happens through the Black Belt of Georgia, Alabama, and into Mississippi, as well as some penetration along the Mississippi River. And then this culminated in one of the early depressions of U.S. history, the Panic of 1837, which sent cotton values spiraling, sent African Americans who were collateralized debt. They were kind of packaged in ways that we are kind of familiar with, as akin to what they did with housings recently. And if you go to the 1840s, you're going to see a much less saturated map, right? Because this is the kind of really shows the long wake of that depression and the length of time that recovery took, which it did begin to recover. Really, there was a kind of resurgence in the 1850s, and you see an increase in the amount of purchasing, particularly along in Arkansas and into Texas, and along the Mississippi and Louisiana and Mississippi. So one quick thing, let's zoom in. We zoom into central Tennessee, one more. Yeah, that's good. No, you go back out. That's perfect. Okay. Can you go back to the 1810s? Mm-hmm. So one story we're interested in telling with this is how the slave trade was a generational ordeal for African American families, right? So what you're seeing here, this is 1810, right? So this is you don't never see much in the mountains, right? The mountains, Appalachians don't support plantation agriculture, but in the area west of the Appalachians and what's called I think geologically, I believe it's a low interior plateau, runs from Louisville, runs from central Kentucky down through central Tennessee into northern Alabama around Huntsville. You see significant purchasing in the 1810s as just western migration. I think they were growing hemp and other things in there. So go to 1820s, you start to see less of that, right? And you start to see a little blue along this section. And then go to the 1830s, and it's pretty much entirely a selling region by this point, right? To grow cotton, the slave trade, people were bought and sold in the slave trade were often of prime age. This would be men and women who are 15 to 25, right? They're at their height of their physical strength, perfect for picking cotton, growing sugar. This is what slaveholders wanted. They wanted young people. So again and again in this map, you see a pattern where areas that were tense purchasers 20, 30 years later are sellers, right? And so what you're seeing is a growing population. This is the argument I want to make, right? There's a growing population, and they have adequate labor, right? There's the limiting factor here is land, right? If you have X number of acres in a county that you can put under cultivation, and if you have enough labor to cultivate that land. Any amount of labor that you own above that is surplus. That's what they would call it, right? And so you turn that labor into a commodity. You turn it into something you can profit with in a different way. And so think about like those 15 to 25-year-olds who are moved into this region. 20 years later, this is their children that are 15 to 25-year-olds that are being sold away from their parents into into Alabama, into Mississippi. And you see this, I won't belabor it, but you see this again and again in up country, South Carolina, along the Black Belt itself. So let's even just jump here. So take this section in down here and jump to the 1850s. This is a pretty blue map, right? I mean, there's still areas on the western edges of the South that are, I mean, and there is a market for this. But you can imagine, when this map helped me understand why slaveholders were so aggressively expansionist in the 1850s, right? And a politics that really set them at odds with Northerners and eventually resulted in a civil war. And I think there's one thing about this is it's kind of like an economic determinism here, that they're used to going into new lands, using enslaved labor to grow cotton, sugar on those lands, profit enormously from that, but also this other product is the reproductive increase in the property that they own that they want to sell to further west, right? This is the pattern, is always being moved further west. And if you don't have lands further west, right, if you're hemmed in by sectional politics or even the land, this becomes like a real choke point in the economy that they're used to and profited enormously from. Okay, want to talk a little bit about how we produce these?
Yeah.
How much time do we got? We got 5 minutes.
Okay. So like Rob said, the issue with this is we're dealing with census data, and we're dealing with census data over an extended period of time. Counties change a lot. Counties go away, new counties appear, which is problematic when you're trying to compare 1810 to 1850.
What county are we in? We're at Fairfax. Okay, thanks. There it is.
So the way we got around this is a method called aerial interpolation. So what you do is to compare, let's say, one county to another, is you intersect these counties, right? And then you assume an equal distribution across both counties. And based on this intersection, you distribute the population equally based on area, right? And then you dissolve based on the new county to get a comparison between the two. So it's called an aerial interpolation. And so that's what we did for this across the years, so that way we could compare to see if a certain area was in-migration or out-migration.
Yep. One thing to that.
Yep.
Yeah, and the way we make these estimates, these are estimates, right, is we assume, and this is an imperfect assumption, but it's the best we can do, we assume a uniform, with the exception of some places in Louisiana, which are just killing zones, we assume a uniform rate of population increase amongst the African American enslaved population, right? So, and we use that as our calculation. So let's say it's pretty high. It's like 25, 30% decade to decade. So let's say it's 25%. I don't remember what it is in the 1850s. And so what we do is we take the population that existed, and we say if there was no in-migration, out-migration, what we would expect is we'd expect a 25% increase above that, right? So that is, what is that? It's not quite 1,000, right? So it would be, we'd expect like 4,000, let's say. And what we see, well, actually I can do the math here because I can do the math. So, and what we actually got in 1860 in the census was 3,100. So that difference is 803, and we assume that that's out-migrated. Those are people who are sold away for the most part. And the converse, let's just click anywhere that's really red. Can you pick the reddest place you can find? Probably is going to be Arkansas. That's great, right there. Louisiana. So Carroll Parish in Louisiana, they had an enslaved population of
6,200 in 1850. That jumps enormously, obviously, to 14,000. That is not a natural increase, right? So that we would have expected, what, 7,500? And so we estimate that there's a forcible, that the 5,600 of the population has been moved in, has probably been purchased, most of them. Yeah, that's it. And why don't we, how much time we got? We got 1 minute. He just hit enlarge on the thingamabob. We also, we have some data visualization. Oh, let's forget it. That's just too complicated to talk about in a minute. We'll call it quits and take questions from you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. We're pretty mindful that we didn't want. Right. I often quote Stalin, favorite person to quote. No, I think it's Stalin that says, right, the death of one person is a tragedy, the death of a million people is a statistic, right? And we were worried and really anxious that by looking at this as an aggregate, which is really important to get the kind of sense of the systemic scope of this, but it also can, in some ways, repeat or echo the dehumanization of the slave trade by treating African Americans as statistics. And it says nothing about the pain of family separations, about the humiliations of being on an auction block and auctioned off. And so we wanted that qualitative, that individual personalized perspective. So we went through 19th century slave narratives looking for instances where people talked about this process, right? They narrated the process for themselves and georeference those. So we just picked one, I think, at random, where, large firm, yada, yada, so. This one's not particularly effective, but it narrates one person's experience, right? So, yeah, so that's the notion, that's the idea behind the narratives. I'm not positive, so a reviewer of this made the point that it's kind of like, you got like a drive-by feeling, and I kind of agree with that. If you read these things, you almost get a nerd to it because it's just like painful experience after painful experience after painful experience, and they're kind of removed from their context, so you do lose some of that. But this was our effort to do this. I'm not positive we've accomplished what we wanted to do, but we're trying. Yes.
For the concentric circles, were they all standardized for the U.S., or is there a way that you determine the depth of the buffers? Is it based spatially?
Yeah, so the way we do that is we pick a lat long for the central business district, which is just kind of us guessing we're downtown, partly on modern, contemporary maps, partly on where it makes sense in some of these maps. And then we just kind of estimated from Burgess's diagram. He seemed to have the loop pretty centralized. So we take
the complete bounds of the polygons, right? So we're staying within the city, right? And then we calculate in from that.
Yeah, we calculate the furthest point, and then we draw our circles, and then do a join and a dissolve to get the estimates for each of these. Or not estimates, they're actually calculations. So. And yeah, so it shows both the distribution of grades within a given ring and as well as density, right? Cities become less dense as you're more further away from the center typically. Yes?
It looks like these circles and the model in general are really based on industrial kind of production in the cities. I'm wondering, even in the period you're looking at, are there any cities that were really not industrially strong and had other economic basis, and did the pattern of housing look any different?
It's a great question. I would say, yeah. I think the answer is yes. I mean, I'm not coming up with one off the top of my head exactly, but I mean, part of the impetus behind this is well, to let people explore these spatially, but also to look at variability within U.S. cities. I picked a couple of and showed a couple that have that kind of bullseye pattern that more or less matches the pattern that Burgess described, but there are other ones that just depart from it
entirely. And so part of this is kind of get exactly what you're talking about, which is the variability in the organization of American cities. And as you can see from here, they do big cities and little cities, right? We got Wheeling and Warren, Ohio, as well as San Francisco. Yeah, like that. I mean, a lot of these are, and Burgess recognizes that mountains, lakes, rivers are going to affect this, right? And so this is a model he's talking about. If anyone is dying to see a city too, shout it out.
San Francisco?
The-
How about comparing that with Oakland?
And so this hopefully will be available to the public soon. So you guys are getting a sneak peek before it's actually live. So this isn't up yet. So we're hoping to, within the month, to get it up.
Have you guys been able to at all look at this compared to modern data and some of the same identifiers that you're using to create the different shades here to extrapolate into what cities look like?
Yeah, not much. We've done this. There's an earlier project we did on Richmond called Redlining Richmond, which is kind of how we got into this. And we did overlay, underlay 20-aughts poverty data, and it matches up shockingly well. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised by this, but we should be shocked, right? That the persistence of wealth and poverty spatially across multiple generations is not something to celebrate by any means.
Yeah.
So we have done it a little bit,
The Federal Reserve is doing some
and we've given
research into this.
Anyone
and-
wants, we're giving this
Yeah.
away here, and anyone who's contacted us knows we're working on it. We've given that away to them, and then we're working on a map. The next one we're going to be tackling is one on urban renewal, and these two will have some relationship to one another, kind of tracing. Not directly, obviously, right? I mean, it's really hard to make causal arguments about the effect of these maps, but we'll be able to make correlations between these maps and urban renewal efforts in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There is no Washington map. Wish we could.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure why, actually. Some of these maps don't get, these are all from the National Archive. Some of them just didn't get in the archive for whatever reason. So we'll have area descriptions but no map. Washington, we have neither. And I don't know if that was, I don't know. I mean, you got to wonder, because there's a federal agency doing this, why they ignore the place that they're headquartered. And there's some explanation there, but I don't know what it is.
Just curious, how do we identify the center of the city?
Arbitrarily. So I go into Google Maps every time we do this, and we might tweak it a little bit as I go in and for cities I don't know, I say downtown Canton, and it zooms me in, and then I look for concentrations, and then I compare it to the existing maps, and it always more or less works out. So for Richmond, we know exactly where the center of downtown is because we live there, and we'll probably tweak this, but in no cases have we, well, actually it's not totally true. Some really suburban communities, they're really tiny and they do not have exactly downtowns. Can you go to Darien, Connecticut? I don't know where we put this one.
In some cities, actually, they start to, what's that come up? They actually start to insert some of these rings in the maps themselves. So it helps the people doing the surveys.
Yeah, that's actually true, yeah. Yeah, Fresno, right?
I think you said Darien, right? Oh, because it's under Stanford, Darien.
These are three communities. So where we put the, I don't remember, where did we put it? Let me hover over and see where we decided it should be, which is sort of arbitrary, yeah.
I think we, picked kind of like, so in the maps, you can kind of see, they tried to outline this kind of downtown area with hash marks, right? The industrial kind of commercial zone. So the map kind of gives us some hints about where this is. This isn't a great example, but sorry, not to go back to Richmond all the time, but if you look at Richmond, see how it's hatched here, right? So this is what they consider the commercial kind of industrial zone. So we kind of start there and then, try to find courthouse, things like that. That would help us,
So I see we're at our mark, so we'll just say thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.